Some cabins shelter you from the wild, but others are the wild, wearing wooden skin and whispering your name through the walls. These are 10 true tales from the heart of the forest. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The forest was supposed to be my escape, a place where the noise of the world fell away, and only the steady rhythm of my breath and boots remained. By late afternoon, the sunlight was already dissolving into mist, thin silver threads weaving between the towering pines. My map was little more than a suggestion at this point, the trail half swallowed by undergrowth and shadows. I told myself it didn't matter. I had camped before, navigated tougher terrain, and I could make it back to the main path by nightfall. But night fell faster than expected, like a curtain ripped down without warning. And soon I was walking through a world where the trees looked like skeletal hands reaching for the stars. That's when I saw it, a faint glow through the fog. At first I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds, but the light was too warm, too deliberate. A lantern swaying in the window of a cabin that shouldn't have been there. My pulse quickened. Relief warred with unease. In the middle of nowhere, a lit cabin could mean safety, or something far worse. As I approached, the air grew thick, carrying a metallic tang like rust or blood. The lantern's glow flickered, casting long, warped shadows that twisted across the clearing like they were alive. The cabin's door creaked open under my touch, releasing a breath of damp, sour air. Inside, the darkness seemed to press in around me. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and every step stirred up the smell of mildew and something sharper, like iron. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, revealing carvings etched deep into the wooden beams. Spirals, jagged symbols, patterns that seemed almost mathematical but not quite human. They reminded me of star charts or scars. My rational mind searched for explanations. Maybe it was an old hunting lodge. Maybe local kids had vandalized it. But a whispering voice deep inside me insisted these marks were older than the cabin itself, older than the forest. I called out, my voice trembling slightly, half hoping someone would answer. Only silence replied, thick and suffocating. A broken chair lay in one corner, its legs splintered like bones. In the center of the room stood a wooden table, and on it, a cracked lantern identical to the one glowing outside. It wasn't lit, yet faint warmth radiated from its metal frame as though it had been burning moments ago. A shiver ran through me. That's when I heard it. A sound so soft I almost mistook it for my imagination. Breathing, slow, measured, coming from somewhere deeper within the cabin. My fight-or-flight response screamed at me to leave, and I obeyed, bolting for the door. But when I stepped outside, the clearing wasn't the same. The path I had followed was gone, replaced by another cabin, identical to the first, with the same warm lantern glowing in its window. I spun in circles, heart pounding, and saw more cabins emerging from the mist, multiplying endlessly like reflections in a shattered mirror. Somewhere behind me, that steady breathing grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from the trees themselves. And then, with a sudden suffocating finality, the lantern light went out. Darkness didn't arrive. It unfolded, petal by petal, until the clearing sealed like a jar with the lid twisted tight. For a moment, I heard only the tick of my watch, a metronome in my skin, and then the breathing resumed, slow as tidewater beneath ice. I told myself it was wind corkscrewing through the rafters, a trick of acoustics from an article I'd read. But denial thins in the dark, like damp paper held near a flame. I raised my flashlight and cut a tunnel through dust. In its pale cone, the nearest cabin waited with its door slightly open, as if mid-sentence when silence fell. I moved because moving felt safer than thinking. My boots found a hiker's cadence, and with each step I repeated a litany, oxygen, direction, map, like a pilot checking instruments. Then I saw the symbols again, fresh grooves pale as raw bark across threshold stones, spirals nested inside angles, a geometry that felt almost predatory. I remembered a cognitive scientist who said the brain's hunger for pattern is like wolves craving scent. Give the mind a knot and it will gnaw until the rope parts. I traced one spiral with a fingertip. Heat pressed up from it, as if a blade had kissed the wood seconds earlier. Whoever carved these was near. Or, an uglier thought, whatever did. I chose a direction at random and walked straight through the copycat cabins. After 10 minutes, the straight line bent. After 20, it folded back on itself like a paper road misprinted by a careless press. I returned to the same clearing without meaning to, a human compass dragged by a hidden magnet. The lantern inside sat cold, and yet the window glowed again, a smear of gold leaking through ink. Dreams insist without evidence. The forest felt fluent in that language. So I turned the flashlight off. The breathing deepened, almost pleased. I spoke into the dark, voice even, telling the woods what I knew. Fear narrows attention like a camera aperture. Isolation warps time perception. Repeating architecture induces déjà vu by overloading the hippocampus. Saying it steadied my hands. Saying it built a scaffold inside my chest. If this was a loop, loops have exits. Break rhythm, break spell. But what if the loop had learned my timing better than I knew it myself? I waited for the next inhale and stepped toward it. The sound retreated, liquid as a tide. I followed, changing pace, counting prime numbers under my breath to scramble any pattern that might be watching. The cabins thinned to silhouettes, then to mast-like posts in a fogged harbor. The ground went springy, moss swallowing my footprints as if the forest were erasing me while I moved. The air cooled, smelling of limestone, wet leaves, and something older. At the clearing's heart, a final doorway stood alone, a frame lifted from its walls like a spine from bone. On the lintel, the symbols converged into something almost readable, a map or a mouth. Cold air poured through. I felt the pull, old as gravity, and knew I could step through. I crossed the threshold, and the breathing moved with me, behind and ahead at once like a doubled heartbeat. Was the way out ever a door or the moment salvation? After months of city sirens and office clatter, the promise of silence seemed almost medicinal. The drive out was long and winding, the asphalt eventually surrendering to gravel, and then to a narrow dirt road carved between ancient pines. My partner Lily sat beside me with her head leaned against the window, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. The cabin appeared through the trees like a memory unearthed. Weathered wood, a pitched roof, smoke rising faintly from a stone chimney. It looked harmless, innocent even. I remember thinking how peaceful it all seemed, the way you might think of a snake before you realize it's coiled and ready to strike. The first night was perfect. We cooked by lantern light, laughed over cheap wine, and fell asleep to the lullaby of crickets and wind. It wasn't until the second evening that things shifted. We were unpacking groceries when I heard it, a whisper so faint I thought it was a trick of the wind. At first I ignored it. Cabins creak, forests speak. The mind fills silence with imagined voices. But then Lily froze, her eyes widening. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. And that's when the voice came again, clearer this time, threading through the wooden walls like smoke. "Did you hear that?" It was her exact words, repeated back to us. We stood there breathless as the echo faded. Rationality clawed its way to the surface. Maybe there was a hidden neighbor, or sound carrying strangely through the valley. But the voice had come from inside the walls, low and intimate, as if the cabin itself had been listening. I pressed my ear against the paneling. Cold air kissed my skin through tiny cracks, and beneath it a murmur, like dozens of overlapping conversations. When I whispered, "Hello?" the walls answered, "Hello?" My own voice, but hollow, distorted, almost curious. The scientist in me, buried beneath layers of fear, grasped for explanations. Sound waves can bend, refract, even trap themselves in structures under certain conditions. Old houses often carry whispers through vents and hollow beams, but this was different. These weren't random fragments. They were deliberate, synchronized perfectly with our words, like a predator mimicking its prey. We searched the cabin, moving room to room, tapping on walls and floors. In the bedroom, I found it. A narrow slit near the baseboard, disguised beneath years of dust. When I pried it open, a dark shaft yawned beneath, leading down into the earth. The air rushing up was icy and smelled faintly metallic, like coins or blood. Lily gripped my arm so tightly her nails dug crescents into my skin. The whispering grew louder, dozens of voices now, weaving together into a chorus that almost, but not quite, formed words. We should have left then. Every instinct screamed at me to grab our bags and run, to abandon the mystery for the safety of ignorance. But curiosity is a dangerous fuel. I told Lily I just needed a minute, a closer look. She begged me not to, her voice breaking like a branch under snow. I lowered my phone flashlight into the vent. At the bottom, far below the cabin, the darkness shifted, as though something was breathing. And then, clear as glass, a voice rose from below. It was mine. "Don't go," it said. I withdrew my hand from the vent as if the dark had teeth, yet the compulsion to know had already set its hook. Lily stood by the bed, hugging herself, a shoreline bracing for storm surge, and I felt her fear trying to anchor me. We argued in urgent whispers, the kind you use when you're trying not to wake whatever sleeps under the floor. I promised I wouldn't go down, only map the direction, only listen. Promises are thin wood when fear is the fire. I pressed my cheek to the boards and felt a tremor, fine as a moth's wing beating in a jar, counting the rhythm the way sailors count waves before a storm. I slid the flashlight into the slit. Dust glittered like plankton in a vertical sea. The chorus below braided and unbraided, a loom of borrowed sentences, as if the cabin had combed our words into thread. I heard our laughter from last night, the clink of the wine bottle, the small apology Lily made without meeting my eyes. It wasn't only replay, it was rehearsal. But what it didn't expect was a countermeasure. I spoke into the future, a test disguised as prayer, whispering the date, the time, and an odd word I had never said aloud. The answer arrived a heartbeat later, wearing my inflection like a stolen coat. It spoke the word, then added one of its own, my name, paired with Lily's, followed by a verb that hadn't happened yet. My scalp tightened. This was no parlor trick of acoustics. Still, superstition hands its lantern to science when it's scared of the dark, so I clung to physics like a rope. Tubes, cavities, resonance. A maze can make echoes sound like intention. I kept repeating that while I traced the ventwork from room to room, my curiosity burning like a wick cut too short. Vents hid under the stove and inside the pantry, seams disguised as age. Each grill inhaled cold air that smelled metallic, like coins rubbed thin between fingers. But what if the maze wasn't making intention? What if it was studying it? They converged at a hatch beneath the rug, wood nailed over wood, a scar that never wanted to be remembered. When I pried it up, a breath from below kissed my face, mineral and sweet like wet leaves going to rot. We lowered a camping light on its cord. The shaft fell into a chamber ribbed by corrugated pipe, stones sweating in the glow. Sound gathered there, flocking and wheeling like starlings at dusk, always almost forming a shape. I wanted to leave. I wanted to know. Two hungers pulled like moon and tide, and the floor between them was me. Curiosity didn't win. It simply refused to lose. I climbed the ladder anyway. Lily's voice clung to me, a shawl against winter, asking me not to go. The rungs were slick with condensation, and each step rang a tone the chamber answered, the way a cathedral makes you part of its instrument. At the bottom, scrape marks chalked the walls where tools had bitten stone. A wheel valve waited under a crust of mineral. When I turned it, something distant shifted, a buried throat clearing, and the whispers snapped into focus. Not many voices, two. Mine and Lily's, layered across time like photographs double exposed. Hope rose, brief and foolish, like a match in wind. The timing was wrong, too exact for randomness, like a drummer keeping pulse inside the hill. The chamber repeated our latest question, then repeated the repetition, a hall of mirrors that never returned the same face. Guilt cut bright as magnesium. There were things I had saved for later, letters never mailed. A draft spiraled my ankles like cold smoke. Then, a whisper rose with surgical clarity. Our names, followed by a date 3 days ahead, and the words we had not yet said. Above me, the hatch eased shut, the light thinned to embers. Somewhere beyond the pipes, the forest inhaled, and I understood the ugliest possibility, that we weren't hearing echoes at all. We were rehearsals, and the thing listening had already learned its lines. The trail began as a promise painted in green blazes on old bark. Steady and generous, the kind of certainty that makes you believe a forest can be domesticated. I set out early, boots still warm from the car heater, breath lifting like pale flags in the cold. The guidebook swore 4 miles to the historic cabin, a modest climb stitched to the hillside. My GPS pulsed with confidence, a neon breadcrumb thread drawing a clean line through topo squiggles. When the first blaze appeared on the wrong side of a trunk, I blamed storms rather than my eyes. The way you forgive a compass for wobbling near magnetite. A mile later, the same boulder greeted me from a new angle, as if it had rotated to watch me pass. I slowed, listening for water to reorient, but the creek's chatter kept trading banks like a bilingual conversation. Landmarks shuffled with polite indifference. A fallen birch that should have been behind me now reclined ahead, a white bone in new grass. I triangulated with compass and sun. The needle obeyed, yet the light misbehaved, a mirror a half step out of true. Déjà vu pressed a warm hand to my shoulder like an old friend who refuses to say their name. But what I didn't expect was how quickly certainty would thin to gauze. I know the science. Novelty colliding with familiarity. The hippocampus filing present tense under a mislabeled tab. The vestibular system protesting a map it didn't draw. Still, knowledge rarely rescues you in the field. Each turn felt rehearsed, coded like a forgotten chart I had sketched in fever. The forest narrowed, then opened in the same breath, trunks sliding at altered distances as if the understory had taken a half step closer. My stride shortened, hope and suspicion braided like rope pulling in opposite directions. I narrated my position to anchor time, sounding like a calm host who didn't quite trust the teleprompter. The trail ahead wore my footprints before I made them. To prove the world solid, I built measurements. I counted paces between blazes, logged elevation on my altimeter, marked a tiny X on my glove with a Sharpie each time I crossed a particular route. The X's multiplied like tally marks in a holding cell. I backtracked to a snag I knew I'd seen before and found my earlier boot print softened by new needles that could not have fallen in minutes. Then came the smell, wood smoke and the faint syrup of old varnish, threading the air where no cabin should be. Caution lost by a nose to hunger and curiosity, those twins that share a heartbeat. The ridge that should have sloped south now leaned east like a book. A pixelated thicket caught mid-breath, so I shut it down and let silence take the space technology vacated. The forest answered with its own circuitry. Beetles ticking in bark, the hush of needles, a far-off knock like knuckles on a hollow door. A crow muttered and flew, a torn sentence crossing the sky. I tested bearings again, then pocketed the compass as if hiding a guilty thought. The path thinned to duff and stones, then simply wasn't there, the way a rumor evaporates when confronted. I stood very still, listening, and the silence leaned in like a doctor with a light. As if conjured by doubt, blazes reappeared. Fresh, glossy, spaced at exact intervals, the paint bright as new leaves. Relief rushed in like warm air from an opened oven. I let the marks shepherd me through a stand of spruce where the soil went springy and the light bruised to late violet. The varnish smell grew louder than the wind. Between the trunks, a roofline slid into view, shingles crouched like a sleeping animal's back. The cabin presented itself with the ease of a photograph sliding out from an envelope, inevitable as a thought you tried not to think. At the porch, my footsteps softened of their own accord. The boards were scarred by generations, edges polished by weather and hands. I reached for the latch and a fine static rose along my forearm, the way air prickles before lightning. Through the glass, a shape moved, small as the turn of a page, then still. I told myself the mind is a maze and fear will walk you in circles until you swear the walls move. Inside a floorboard side, familiar as my own breath, a face tilted toward the window, pale in the dim. It wore my features like a well-fitted mask, and smiled. The smile should have belonged to a mirror, but there was no pain, only distance, timber, and my pulse in my ears like small hammers. I lifted my hand and the figure didn't match. It kept its palm down, as if my gesture were a language it refused to learn. Then the latch turned with a slow, deliberate click, and the vibration traveled through the porch rail. A tuning fork struck under my ribs. The door settled into its frame like a lid on a jar, locked. Varnish sweetened the air. Behind the glass, a shape shifted with patient grace, like a hawk riding thermals over a field that hasn't learned it is prey. But what if I was the field? Reason had always been my compass when the map went strange. If the mind can misplace streets and names, if déjà vu can counterfeit recognition, then a face can be minted from hunger and expectation. I circled the cabin counting paces, scraping a notch in bark, noting a crescent scar on a spruce. When I returned, the notch sat higher, as if the tree had inhaled. The same window watched, following like a portrait's eyes. Inside, the figure paced with my gait but not my timing, a metronome set to a different room. I told myself misalignment proves falseness. The thought felt brave and thin. like paper armor in rain. I knocked to prove the world still had rules. Wood replied with a damp heartbeat. The figure tilted its head, my habit exactly, the way a dog listens for a whistle no one else can hear. I shaped my name without sound. He returned silence arranged like patience. Then his hands moved through gestures I knew from my own explanations. Here's the model. Here's the error. Here's the risk we forgot to price. The last motion was small and almost kind, the hush people use for frightened children. Anger flared and went out, a match pinched between fingers. I waited for fear to claim the floor, but awe arrived first, quiet as snow. The forest pressed close, attentive, like an audience in blackout. I thought about grid cells firing like lanterns on a hidden street map, about place cells soldering memory to coordinates. If two maps overlap imperfectly, you get a double city, two address systems for one afternoon. Maybe this cabin was the hinge between them. Maybe I had stepped into the crease of a folded day. Awe slid under fear and set the whole thing ringing, like glass touched by a spoon. If I was the hinge, which version of me swung? But what they never mention is how hinges wear down. I wrote a sentence only I would write, a private memory braided to a false date, and pressed the note to the glass. The other me lifted a page already scrawled with the same crooked line, the same ink bloom, even the hesitation in the G where my hand always stalls. Either he was me or he had studied me past marrow. The latch quivered, not opening but breathing. The green blazes along the eaves brightened slick as wet leaves and rotated, pointing away from the door toward a path that had not existed a breath ago. Then the latch stirred again, and everything leaned inward to listen, closer. By the time we realized we were lost, the sun had already begun its slow descent, leaking gold through the trees like a dying lantern. The four of us had come to the National Forest for a weekend hike. 2 nights, simple trails, nothing that should have gone wrong. But wrong crept in gradually like fog rising off a swamp. The map grew less familiar with each step. Trail markers appeared in odd places, and the confident laughter we'd started with dissolved into uneasy silence. When night began to stretch its fingers between the trees, we admitted what none of us wanted to say aloud. We were hopelessly off course. Then, just as panic began to bloom, a figure appeared ahead of us on the path. His Green Ranger uniform was a blessing to our exhausted eyes, his calm wave a promise of salvation. Relief hit so hard it made me dizzy. He greeted us warmly, his voice smooth and measured, like a teacher soothing frightened children. He introduced himself as Ranger Whitlock and offered to lead us to a nearby ranger cabin where we could rest until morning. It sounded perfect, too perfect. Still, desperation makes even the wary obedient, and we followed him. The hike to the cabin felt endless, the forest stretching like a rubber band. Whitlock spoke little, asking strange clipped questions. Our full names, our dates of birth, even the make of our car back at the trailhead. When I asked about cell reception or a nearby road, his answers were vague, like fog that refused to clear. His uniform struck me as odd too, clean and crisp, but outdated, with an insignia I didn't recognize. I told myself I was imagining things, that anxiety was sharpening shadows into monsters. When the cabin finally emerged from the dark, it looked ancient, built of thick, weathered logs, its windows glowing faintly with the orange light of a single lantern. It felt like stepping back in time. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the scent of mildew and old paper. A fireplace crackled weakly, as if lit for show rather than warmth. There was no radio, no first aid supplies, no signs of modern equipment, just dusty furniture and ledgers stacked neatly on a table. Whitlock urged us to sit and rest. My friends collapsed gratefully onto worn chairs, but my unease deepened. Something about the place felt wrong. The shadows seemed to cling too tightly to the corners, and the silence between the ranger's words felt rehearsed. When he stepped outside for firewood, I wandered to the stack of ledgers, brushing away dust thick enough to choke on. The first page I opened was dated decades earlier, listing maintenance logs and patrol notes written in elegant, looping script. My pulse thudded as I flipped through, the years peeling backward like layers of skin. Then I saw it, a black and white photograph tucked between pages. My breath froze. It was Whitlock, unmistakable, his face younger but his uniform exactly the same. The photo was dated 1973. Behind me, the cabin door creaked. A long shadow spilled across the floorboards, stretching impossibly far. And then came his voice, low and final. No one leaves. My friends looked at me, faces blanched into lantern masks, while the photograph scorched my palm like a brand. Whitlock filled the doorway with patient weight, Brim slicing his eyes into coins. The latch settled, a period at the end of a sentence none of us wanted. I told myself, wood swells, metal sticks, systems fail. Physics is a rope to grip when dark rises. Reassurance felt like paper armor in rain. Relief demanded a toll, and betrayal collected it. Outside, Knight leaned closer, listening like a clerk at a confessional grate. He told us to rest. We didn't. The fire crackled as if coached, yet the logs refused to blacken. Resin beaded on bark like sweating glass. I stepped to the window, counting heartbeats like rungs on a ladder out of a well. Outside, the forest held its breath. No moth at the pane, no wind in the needles, as if time were cupped in cold hands. The sill was bolted with iron clenched like an arthritic fist. Lena listed options in a medic's cadence as the room listened harder the quieter we became. A draft climbed through the floorboards carrying ledger musk, damp wool, and a mineral chill like a cave mouth. I opened a book, hunting for call signs, frequencies, any modern anchor. Instead, I found careful entries for parties escorted and supplies delivered, seasons looping like a record with a hairline crack. In the margin, Whitlock's right-leaning hand repeated two words, accounted for. A raised nail grazed my wrist. Blood purled like a berry, and the paper drank it without complaint. We needed a door, or a lie that behaved like one. A timber bar lay across it, polished by generations of uncertain hands. Tyler lifted. The wood resisted, not stuck but willful, the way a sleeping animal refuses to be moved. Whitlock's shadow lengthened past his boots and kept going, a tide without surf advancing through the room. His smile was a museum smile, courteous and extinct. I asked about radios again. He said the lines were down, then offered a weather report from a winter decades dead. The air tasted coin bitter, and the lantern buzzed, thinly, insistently there. History can be a jammed key, so I tried turning it. New policies, wildfire seasons, the patch replacing the emblem on his sleeve. He listened the way a statue listens to birds. The hurt didn't stab. It settled, heavy as wet wool. Awe threaded it anyway. Here stood a living footnote, or something wearing its shape. The rational part of me pawed at causes. Magnetism, isolation, performance. The human part heard our names being shelved. If the forest had a clerk, he would file us by date, then close the book and blow dust away. Lena mouthed window and Tyler braced the frame. The glass flexed and refused, flexed again like lake ice in a thaw. The lantern guttered. The room breathed with it. Pages rasped, though no hand moved, and a fresh ledger opened. 4 blank lines waited like open graves. Beneath them, faded ink ghosted a date, 1973. Hope flared, reckless as a match. I set the photograph beside the page. 2 Whitlocks stared across Eris with one unblinking gaze. The latch lifted a fraction. Smoke curled into a question mark, inviting a signature now. I first saw the smoke at dusk, a thin gray column unraveling into the sky like a thread being pulled from the earth itself. It rose beyond the tree line, delicate yet urgent, a signal against the dying light. After 2 days of hiking with no sign of another soul, that smoke felt like hope made visible. My feet, sore and blistered, quickened with renewed purpose. Maybe it was a campfire, or someone lost like me, or even a ranger station. Anything was better than the isolation that had begun to hum beneath my skin like static. The forest deepened as I followed the rising plume. Branches knitted overhead, dimming the last gold of sunset until everything was rendered in muted green and shadow. The smell came first, a sweet, acrid scent that reminded me of burnt paper and wet leaves. It made my throat tighten, yet there was no heat, no wind to carry embers. I told myself the air could play tricks, carrying scents from miles away. But as the light faded, the smoke grew denser, the column more defined, as if guiding me like a lighthouse meant only for the lost. When I reached the clearing, my breath stalled. A cabin stood perfectly intact, its logs weathered but unburned, windows unbroken, roof unscarred. And yet the ground around it was blanketed in ash, soft as snow beneath my boots. I crouched, rubbing it between my fingers. It was cold, lifeless, like the ghost of a fire long dead. The smell of burning intensified, clawing at my throat until I coughed into my sleeve. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing handprints scattered across the porch, smeared in soot as though people had tried to flee or tried to claw their way inside. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with a trembling hand, expecting heat or smoke to billow out. Instead, a suffocating stillness greeted me. Inside, every surface was covered in ash. Chairs, tables, even the stone hearth sat buried under a fine gray powder. The hearth itself was spotless, untouched by flame. No logs, no embers, no sign of fire had ever burned there. I walked slowly through the single room, my boots leaving trails like signatures in untouched snow. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe there had been a wildfire years ago, the cabin somehow spared while the surrounding forest burned. But why did the smoke look so fresh, so alive tonight? My rational mind grasped at scientific straws, particulate matter drifting from hidden peat fires, atmospheric inversions making distant smoke appear closer. The forest was full of mysteries like that, wasn't it? Night fell hard, and the smoke outside thinned to nothing. I set up my tent nearby, too tired to move on, but too unsettled to sleep inside the cabin. As darkness swallowed the clearing, silence spread like frost. Then, just before midnight, I woke choking. My tent reeked of smoke. Stumbling out, I saw the column rising again. Only now it was thicker, rolling upward like a dark artery feeding the sky. But the cabin remained pristine, its windows dark and lifeless. Somewhere beneath the ash, I thought I heard breathing. By dawn, the column had weakened to a faded ribbon, a bruise on the sky where night's thumb had pressed. Ash filmed my tongue. I broke camp with the deliberate motions of someone who trusts ritual more than luck, and I circled the cabin for tracks that were not mine. Wind hadn't moved the powder. It lay in drifts and whirls like fossilized weather. I brushed the porch rail and a gray tide lifted, motes pirouetting in my headlamp beam like dust dances in a cathedral when morning pours through windows. The clearing smelled like burnt paper and coins. Hope beat against caution like wings against a jar. If there was a fire, it hid its heart well. I kept returning to the hearth, the immaculate absence where a flame should have lived. The grate was cool metal, and in its reflection I saw my face stippled with ash, freckles of yesterday's weather. Outside, the column thickened again, not from chimney or stovepipe, but from the ground itself, as if the soil exhaled. I knelt and pressed my ear to the floorboards. A faint hiss answered, rhythmic as a sleeper's breath. But what I didn't expect was the syllable carried inside that breath, an almost name, rounded by distance. Reason offered lifelines, peat burning underground, inversion layers, tricks of terrain. Yet the room felt attentive, like a congregation when the hymn falters and everyone waits for the next note. I pried up a plank with my knife. Beneath the cabin, a crawl space opened like a mouth. Char streaked the joists, yet nothing had burned through. The earth there was soft and black, the texture of cooled bread. When I sifted it, shapes emerged, thin coins of bone, a brass button vitrified at the eye, a ring fused to a pea of glass. Heat had been here once, a sun that chose what to bless and what to spare. The ash did not cling like dirt. It clung like touch. I whispered that I was sorry, and the powder lifted in a breath that was not mine. Grief moved through the crawl space like a slow tide, precise and patient. By noon, the wind died and sound clarified. From the tree line came the sibilant stitch of needles. From the chimney, nothing. From the crawl space, a slow collective exhale. I thought of aerosol physics, of particle size, PM 2.5 migrating through lungs like quiet thieves at a crowded station. We are chimneys, I remembered, drawing the world through us one breath at a time. A flake landed on my tongue and tasted bitter, mineral, faintly sweet, paper singed at the edges. Hope flickered anyway, thin as a match in wind. If this was only smoke, I could move upwind and be done. But the column stood where wind should rule, obedient to a different weather. At twilight, the column sharpened. Figures stood inside it, outlines shingling like scales, as rain reveals its bones when backlit. Arms lifted and fell, a rhythm of signaling that never earned an answer. The path out rewritten, letters smudged to bramble. Night arrived. I should have run, but the body decided first. A cough tore free, sharp as a snapped twig, then another, deeper, dragging grit from hidden shelves. The taste was cabin and coin, paper and winter. The column thinned, satisfied, while a new gloom unwound against the eaves, then thickened into a steady hush that erased the world one contour at a time. By dusk, the road was gone, and my rented cabin felt like a punctuation mark at the end of a blank page. I stacked wood, checked batteries, and pretended self-sufficiency tasted like victory rather than canned soup. Silence enlarged the room the way low tide enlarges a shoreline. When the wind paused, the house kept breathing, timbers settling, pipes ticking, reminders that emptiness still has a voice. Midnight drew a clean line across the clock. 3 knocks followed, crisp and evenly spaced, like someone wrapping a ruler on a desk. I froze with the kettle half raised. The sound came from the door. The door came from the dark. The dark came from everything beyond the small circle of my lamp. I waited, counting to steady my hands. Nothing else arrived. I blamed wood swelling, nerves, altitude sketching ghosts in the margin, then slid the bolt and slept light as a fox on borrowed snow. The next night, the knocks returned at exactly 12, 2, then 3, then 5, each set separated by a measured breath. The pattern was clean as snowfall on a black road. Prime numbers, I thought, and felt an embarrassed spark of pride, the way a student brightens at a familiar equation. I wrote them in my notebook as if transcription made me steward rather than target. But what I didn't expect was how the pattern kept learning me as I tried to learn it. When I approached the door, the hinges gave a listening shiver. By the 3rd night, the storm had soldered the windows with ice ferns, white veins mapping a body I lived inside but didn't own. The knocks arrived with new grammar. 13, a pause, then a run of beats grouped in 2s and 3s, a percussion etude performed by an invisible student. I set a mug on the floor to rattle with each strike and charted intervals as if drawing constellations. My breath left fog on the glass like surrender flags. Deep in muscle, a certainty woke. The sequence wanted more of me than fear. I pressed my ear to the wood. The door was cold, but the rhythm felt warm, intimate as a hand on the sternum. I measured time against the tiny hammer in my throat. The alignments grew exact, then anticipatory, the way a conductor lifts a baton a heartbeat before sound. Fear and logic braided like rope under strain. If the knocks were call and response, who had spoken first? Who was echoing whom? Snow muted every exterior reference. No tracks on the porch, no branch near enough to tap, no loose shutter to explain arithmetic. I wrapped a scarf around my mouth and cracked the door. The night smelled like iron and pine. Sound spilled outward and died, as if the cold were a sponge. The knock ceased while the door was open, then resumed the moment I latched it. Obedient as lab equipment and almost affectionate. The 4th midnight brought syncopation. A skipped beat falling exactly where my pulse stumbled after I rushed the stairs. I tested the hypothesis the way scientists and frightened people do, with repetition. I sprinted the room. The pattern answered, breathless when I was breathless, calm when I was calm, an accompanist in an unseen pit matching the soloist it couldn't see. At exactly 12, the sequence stopped mid-phrase, silence like a sucked-in breath, and my hand found the bolt just as a new knock landed once, clean, close, and entirely inside my skull. It wasn't in the door anymore. It bloomed behind my ribs like a small fist learning the shape of a drum. The room went still, everything taking witness duty while the knocks and my pulse negotiated terms. I pressed my palm to my sternum and felt the answer rise to meet it, a tide-kissing shore. The notebook waited on the table, numbers marching toward a meaning refusing to show its face. Snow hushed the cabin until it sounded like a seashell. Inside an ocean, beats sketched a coastline I knew and didn't. If the sound lived in me, why did the wood listen? Hope and dread braided like rope. I made tea for courage as if steam could build a citadel. The sequence arrived in taut phrases. Prime clusters nested inside longer runs. A mathematician's lullaby braided with an athlete's cadence. Each flare in my chest sent a corresponding tap through wood and frame, a translation too faithful for coincidence. I counted aloud, held my breath. The rhythm paused, resumed with my exhale, like a mirror choosing when to reflect. But what if it wasn't copying me at all? What if I was the echo of something older, instrument rather than player? Curiosity tugged, a fish in dark water, and fear tugged back, a hook I couldn't see. I tried to disprove the body theory. I sprinted the stairs, then went motionless while the second hand swept. The knock swelled when I climbed, softened when I stilled, and tucked triplets into the gaps where my heart stuttered on caffeine and altitude. Reason offered vocabulary, entrainment, feedback, mechanotransduction, labels pinned to a butterfly I could not release. Fear translated them into a single syllable heavy on the tongue: mine. Each explanation felt like snow packed into a wound, cooling the edge while nothing healed beneath. I moved furniture, mapped echoes, and found the house's favored notes. The door loved F, the rafters loved A, my body loved survival. I listened harder. By the fifth night, the storm had sculpted the world into the negative of itself. I ate sparingly and listened greedily, tuning the cabin like a violin, shifting rugs and cups to test resonances. I became less a resident than an instrument. Throat a hollow reed, bones a marimba, blood a metronome. The knocks turned into music, then language, then something older than both, the way wind tutors glaciers. At midnight, the sequence unfurled like a staircase lit from below. 2 beats, 3, 5, 8, Fibonacci loosening its coil, then a pause that ached with intention. The latch twitched without wind. Metal tasted air. Heat rushed my face like standing by an oven. I set my hand on the wood and felt my pulse returning from the other side, a traveler knocking to be let in. The pattern quickened, then collapsed into the simplest truth the body keeps. 1 beat insisting, then 1 more. I lifted the bolt. The door burst inward on a gust of nothing. Snow ribbons spiraled through moonlight, and the knocking filled the room at once, not a visit, but a confession. The emptiness smelled like iron and pine and panic. My chest battered my palm like a trapped bird, and the house answered in sympathy. The kettle screamed, and the knocks vanished so abruptly the silence grew angles. I came to the family cabin to sand grief down to something manageable. A quiet week to sort drawers and drink the kind of silence you have to chew. The cabin sits where meadow unspools into old pines, a stitch between 2 fabrics. On the first evening, the sky bruised to violet and a chill walked the grass. That's when I noticed the figure at the tree line, upright, still, the distance of a thrown stone plus a dare. It looked human the way a scarecrow looks like a plan, convincing until you stand too close. I told myself it was a trick of contrast, the eye misreading branch and shadow. The shape didn't wave or wander. It simply corrected the horizon, like a comma where I hadn't planned to pause. The air smelled of sap and iron. Crickets worked their looms and the meadow ticked with hidden life. I raised binoculars, the lenses turning dusk into glass. The figure had a head and shoulders and no face at all, only a smooth dark where features should be, like bark peeled from a tree and held up to judge the light. Sleep should have reset the board. Morning usually sharpens edges and thins fear, the way sun pulls fog apart thread by thread. I hiked the ridge to prove distance obedient, counting paces, cataloging landmarks with museum care. The figure kept its station just beyond the last firs, neither nearer nor farther, a moon that refused parallax. Awe-threaded dread, quiet as snowfall. If perspective fails, what else lies? But what I didn't expect was the strange relief that arrived with its persistence, some boundaries. Even eerie ones can spare you. By noon I brewed coffee and gave the thing a job, be a border, keep the forest where it belongs. It obliged or pretended to, always exactly where the trees began. The cabin creaked in heat. A blue bottle mapped lazy cursive against the window. I checked for tracks and found only my own, stitched and restitched, as if the grass were editing me. Through glass the figure blurred, then clarified, the way memory chooses a version. Humor skittered across my nerves like a skipped stone and sank without ceremony. The land is full of watchers, owls, deer, the neighbor's invisible tractor hours, but this one studied back. In the afternoon I tested it, walking farther than comfort, crossing the stream to where stones bruised my arches. The figure obliged again, resetting to the same span, patient as a teacher with chalk that never shortens. I lifted the binoculars and counted the nothings where eyes and mouth should be. My pulse drummed like knuckles under a table before confession. If it only mirrored distance, why did my stomach drop when it tilted its head the way I tilt mine? By dusk, anxiety had teeth. I set 3 motion cameras along the meadow's edge, small black teeth biting fence posts, their angles overlapping like a net thrown over a shadow. The red LEDs armed with obedient blinks. I told myself physics loves witnesses and records faithfully. Night rose from the grass like smoke. The figure held its border, faithful as a rumor. Near midnight, I checked the feeds, hungry for proof. The monitors returned perfect frames of meadow and trees in a single standing form. It wore my jacket and my stance and waited to see what any feed opened a hollow under my ribs. as if the meadow had quietly removed a floorboard. I scrubbed through the timeline expecting glitches, pixel snow, any mercy technology might offer. Instead, the frames stayed calm. Each time I stepped onto the porch, a figure arrived at the tree line. Each time I raised binoculars, it raised nothing. Arms slack, chin tilted, a portrait waiting for its painter. The face on the screen was mine until it wasn't. When I zoomed, the mask became smooth bark again, featureless and precise. I checked timestamps, triangulated angles, mapped sight lines with string between fence posts until the yard looked like a geometry problem abandoned by a tired student. The cameras agreed the figure was me and not me, an answer that multiplied questions. The scientist in me offered an alibi, observer effect, autofocus hunting faces, algorithms mistaking symmetry for identity. But what I didn't expect was how the grief I'd come here to file slid a chair beside me as if summoned. Loss is a lens. It sharpens edges and erases context, like frost drawing silver veins across a window. I staged an experiment. I put on my father's faded cap and a red scarf and stood where all three lenses could see me. On screen, the watcher already wore the cap, already knotted the scarf, a second ahead as though it had rehearsed my choices overnight. I raised an arm. The figure didn't mirror so much as anticipate, wrist lifting with mine and stopping just before I did, like it knew when I would hesitate. My humor skittered and died. If it was a mirror, it preferred prophecy to reflection. Toward evening, the light flattened to tin. I carried a folding chair to the meadow's edge and sat where the grass makes its first promise to become forest. Wind combed the stems. The figure held exactly where the trees begin, patient as January. I spoke to the air anyway, letting words assemble into something softer than demand. The cabin listened. The pines listened. In the blue hour, the watcher tipped its head once, the way my father did when he conceded a point and asked me to keep going. The gesture landed like a hand on my shoulder. At dawn, I changed tactics. Stakes every 10 steps, chalk numbers on each wrist, a metronome tapping pocket time. I walked away from the porch while filming my own face, making the camera the audience, making myself the stage. The world behaved until I stopped and reviewed. In every clip, the tree line contained me, distant and small, jacket dark against the green. Advancing frame by frame, the distant me looked up and shaped a word my throat had not yet formed. But what if the footage wasn't lagging? What if I was? By afternoon, I accepted what evidence insisted. The watcher arrived with whatever attention I aimed, a portrait painted by gaze. I taped a small X on the phone's front lens and hit record, then walked toward the trees until needles brightened like wet lacquer. In live view, I approached myself. My breath fed the speaker in small tides. I raised a hand. The figure raised a heartbeat sooner. The meadow tightened, a drum skin pulled true. I kept walking, the border humming against my shins, and the frame filled with me until only bark remained. When I lowered the phone, the tree line stood empty, and from the porch, the cameras captured a single figure standing very still, back turned to the meadow, my jacket dark against the cabin door. Morning arrived on the lake like a coin lowered into blue glass. I rowed because the outboard had decided to sulk, and I preferred the honest complaint of oars. The hull ticked against tiny waves. Trout dimmed below like smoke under ice. I'd come for quiet and found a cathedral of it, the kind that feeds and empties you at once. A loon called, a silver bell in a nave of spruce, and the shore withdrew like a thought I couldn't finish. Wind-braided ripples, small sequins stitched across silence tonight. At the bait shack, a clerk with ropey hands said the lake was new and old at once. They'd dammed the river in the 70s, and the valley traded roofs for water. In drought, a steeple sometimes scolded the sky. I filed it as folklore and bought earthworms. History feels theoretical until it fogs your glasses. By noon, the water ran clear as memory rubbed too hard, details polished to shine. Then the boat drifted over shadow that wasn't cloud. First a line, then a rectangle, then the precise geometry of carpentry revealed itself. The roof ridge, the porch outline, the door's black mouth. I leaned and the scene leaned with me. Refraction doing what refraction does, but the structure held. Shingles lay like fish scales, moss furred the railings, and a tin bucket slept upright as if waiting for a hand. My oar kissed the surface and the picture trembled, but did not leave. Curiosity and caution braided a rope and pulled from opposite banks. I dropped a lead line, 30 feet, then 40. Cold climbed my wrists. Sun angled down like a white spear and broke where the water thickened. I told myself about Secchi discs and thermoclines, about how sound loses itself where layers meet. But what I didn't expect was the feeling that rose in me, recognition without a name. Like rereading a letter you're sure you wrote and cannot place. I anchored by the rental cabin. Paint flaked to confetti, stovepipe tilting like a question. After dark, the lake exhaled lamb's wool mist. Then lights woke under the water. 3 windows in a neat row glowing as if supper were ready. Muffled voices moved with the fog, syllables round as stones rolled in a creek. The air smelled of walnuts and wet lumber. My breath went ritual thin. I tried the rational stories first. Methane bubbles can carry light. Plankton bloom. Pranksters staple LEDs to drown trees. The voices? Waveguides, maybe. Sound tunneling along a temperature gradient. The lake answered with another lit square, a doorway brightening like a lantern behind a cupped hand. Awe and fear braided tight as an umbilical. Sleep came shallow and strange. The clock ground minutes like a millstone. Near midnight, a hum threaded the boards, domestic, insistent, and my stovepipe glowed dull. At dawn, the lake lay ironed flat, and the windows underground went gray again. I brewed coffee that tasted of pennies and resolve, then sat on the dock with my wetsuit folded like a shed skin. If the town could drown and still light its lamps, perhaps it wanted a witness. I strapped on a flashlight, looped a line to the cleat, drew breath until my lungs were 2 bright rooms, and slid into the water as the surface closed like a door. Cold clamped my jaw as I descended, each flutter kick subtracting daylight. The lake narrowed to a green corridor of drifting snow, secrets unfastened from the bottom. At 15 feet the thermocline bit. The cold named each knuckle. My exhale climbed in silver ladders and broke without sound. A dead branch brushed my shoulder and burst into silt. Ahead, geometry assembled from gloom, a house with moss-furred shingles and a dull porch window. I hovered at the eaves like a moth considering a window. The roofline matched the clerk's story and my sketch, even the tin bucket by the steps. Perch muscled past, indifferent, scales reciting light. I palmed the siding. Algae laid velvet over timber. The door hung ajar. I pushed it. Inside, the rooms behaved like dreams. Table set for 3, a stove that had forgotten heat, jars with labels peeled to white. At the hallway's end, a mirror waited with lake patience. My beam touched it and a slow, distorted me returned, as if the glass were chewing my outline. Then the windows brightened, as though a lamp had been switched on underwater. Voices arrived through bone rather than ear, a domestic murmur asking small questions, agreeing to become a life. But what I didn't expect was the scent, or the memory of it. Walnut stain and wet wool, arriving with such clarity, I almost lifted the seal on my mask. A tug moved through the doorway, persuasive as a child. My guideline thrummed against the jamb. In the bedroom, a trunk yawned. Inside lay a quilt patterned in uneven diamonds, the twin of the throw on my rental's couch. I touched one corner and the fabric parted like moths. Beneath it, a key glinted dull as a winter coin. When I closed my fist, the house shivered. The mirror quivered. Somewhere a bell rang like cutlery in a sink. Curiosity leaned the scale, then prudence nudged it back toward the surface. Air is a math problem you solve or you drown. My computer ticked stern blue, so I reversed with palm on wood, fins careful. Outside, the porch posts leaned as if wind moved where none could. The surface brightened like a lid lifting. I rose slowly, equalizing to the lake's long sentence. 30 feet. 20. 10. The water unmade my reflection and handed back sky, and the cold let go in a single reluctant inch. The lake kept time like a cautious, heavy-breathing animal nearby. When my head broke through, the shore had shifted its furniture. Pines stood closer, hemmed by new water. The rental cabin that should have been to my right was below me now, porch combed by current, stovepipe exhaling a ribbon of bubbles. I treaded while minnows grazed the doorknob where my hand should be. The dock angled down like a finger pointing at a mistake that still insisted on being true. I swam for the boat and found only a shadow. Oars drifted past like forgotten sentences. The line I had tied to the cleat rose into sky and returned to water, attached to nothing. Underneath, 3 windows woke amber as evening kitchens. Voices rose with the mist, one wearing my cadence. I coughed lake back into lake and felt the key press my palm as the water behind me in a gray ribbon, and the cabin surfaced from the trees like a thought I'd been avoiding. It had the curated charm of a listing: string lights, a stack of birch, a welcome mat that promised more than it could police. Inside smelled of pine cleaner and old rain, familiar as a sweater borrowed. I told myself I was here to rest, to let a rough season settle like silt in water. Silence steadied the rafters. My name sounded foreign when I tried it aloud. On the coffee table lay a leather-bound journal the color of tea. A card beneath it said, "Guest log, share your story." The cover was soft where hands had worried it. The ribbon hung like a vein. I opened to tidy entries: trail suggestions, stove quirks, directions to a swimming hole. Then the tone tipped. The writer, only initials, described a flicker in the kitchen light, a kettle screaming without boiling, a footstep on the porch when the deck was empty. I smiled at superstition, the way tourists collect omens like leaves. An hour later, my kitchen light stuttered, the kettle chirped on a cold burner, and a board sighed outside with the weight of a boot. Coincidence is a generous accountant. I wrote the matches off as taxes on imagination. Still, the entries braided with my minutes too neatly, like a poem that rhymes with your day. The journal said the wind scraped the flue. A copper taste rose. It said the deck remembered names. Snowmelt revealed initials like fossils. But what did the book expect when the present kept obeying its past? I cooked what the journal never mentioned, turned every light on, sang to drown the hush. 5 minutes later, I burned the onions exactly as the initials predicted. The next line described the alarm chirping with a battery I would not find. The drawer offered everything but twine, cards, 3 openers, a key with no lock. The writer noted the far ridge wearing a hat of fog. Through the window I watched the brim lower. Humor skittered and died. I felt accompanied and robbed, like hearing my thoughts narrated half a step ahead. I tried to dismantle the spell with reasons. Priming plants an image the eye later harvests. Confirmation bias loves a checklist. Yet the handwriting cut closer than theory. At 5:41 p.m., a single knock at the back door. My watch rolled to 5:41 and, gentle as a polite mistake, something tapped the glass. Metaphor reached anyway. The day folded like a map I hadn't drawn, and I walked its creases. Awe threaded fear like ivy on brick, softening and tightening at once. But what else would the book predict if I kept turning pages? Dusk diluted the edges. I poured a drink I didn't need and turned more pages. The lines thinned to wire. "Don't read past the ribbon," one margin warned. I read on. Now the entries named feelings I hadn't voiced. The ache under my breastbone. The name I refused to text. The way grief keeps time like a slow drummer. The next page carried today's date, describing the red thread on my cuff and the tilt of the lamp. "If you're reading this," the last line began, "it's already too late." Floorboards exhaled, and the cabin inhaled me, a slow draw matching the tremor along my spine. I didn't turn. The journal lay open like a shallow river and the ribbon looked wet. I told myself to step outside, to reset the page with cold air and distance, but the door had receded, framed in dusk like a painting you can't approach. I wrote to stall because sound felt expensive and ink was cheap. The nib scraped and my sentences braided a rope I might climb. I am here. The lamp hums. The glass is black. I am not prey. The script steadied as if the book corrected my hand, and in the margin the previous initials rose faint as breath on a mirror. But what they didn't expect was how quickly writing became listening. I tested the room the way a diver tests depth. 1 foot to the rug, 1 breath, 1 glance at the window, where my face floated like a question. Outside, frost lacquered the grass with tiny mirrors. A shape might have stood at the tree line, or it might have been the seam where dark meets darker. The next page crackled. A sketch showed the room, an arrow to the coffee table and a caption. "Lift here." The rug resisted like an old dog woken from a nap. Beneath a hatch waited, iron ring cold as a bitten coin. I didn't plan to open it. I opened it. Cellar air rose, mineral and apple sweet. Stairs descended into a square of dark. On the first riser, a date from decades ago. On the second, initials that weren't mine, but would be if a loop decided it. At the bottom, a narrow room arranged itself from damp and patience. Shelves lined the walls with objects the cabin remembered. A kettle twin to mine, a deck of cards missing queens, a stack of journals swollen with seasons. I opened one and found my morning already filed. The chipped blue bowl, the coin I keep for laundromats I avoid, the 3 berries I rinsed and didn't eat. The entry ended with a sentence I had not yet thought. I closed the book and the room drew tighter. Overhead, soft steps crossed the floorboards in the rhythm of my walk. The hatch eased shut with a courteous click. The lamp dimmed. I called up. Air answered in my tone. The journal fluttered and chose a fresh page, the ribbon migrating like a vein choosing a new path. I wrote again, surrender disguised as authorship. I described the cellar, the shelves, the sense of being archived spine first. Ink hadn't dried when a line appeared above mine, in a hand not mine and perfectly mine. Footsteps approach. Another followed. Do not look back yet. Every cell turned like iron toward a magnet. I stood, lamp shaking, aware of breath where a shoulder would be if the room remembered me wrong. The page waited. My name arrived in careful letters, then the sentence from upstairs. If you're reading this, it's already too late. Behind me, the steps reached the last stair and paused. I lifted the pen because that was the only door left. The tip touched paper, and a new sentence began to write itself while I stood still and listened in the dark. The forest had been chasing me all night. Not the trees themselves, but the memories it carried. The kind that moved like predators just beyond sight. Every step cracked frozen leaves, and each sound behind me felt borrowed from another life. I ran without a map, lungs raw, heart a hammer striking wet wood. The dark seemed endless, stitched shut by branches that clawed at my coat. Somewhere in the distance, a lantern swayed, its glow thudding through the mist like a heartbeat. I'd seen that light before, too many times. I couldn't tell if it was leading me or luring me, but my legs followed anyway. Fear sharpens instincts until their knives pointed inward. The air smelled of iron and ash, a mingling of every nightmare this forest had ever birthed. Behind me came the steady cadence of boots. The park ranger who wasn't real, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the snow. I didn't dare glance back. The stories of this place weren't just tales. They were parasites, attaching themselves to the living, growing fat on belief. Now they were converging, their echoes folding over one another like storm fronts colliding. Branches parted and I stumbled into a low hollow, where the fog thickened into shapes. Smoke curled around my ankles, cold and choking. It didn't rise from fire. It rose from absence, the ghostly exhalation of those who never made it out. I coughed, gagged, tried to push forward. The smoke moved like a living tide, whispering names I didn't want to recognize. My name was among them, carried on a breath that wasn't mine. I surged uphill, desperate for higher ground, until my foot snagged on something buried beneath the frost. A journal. Its pages fluttered as if stirred by invisible hands, lines of frantic handwriting crawling across them in real time. I saw the words form before I read them. If you're reading this, it's already too late. I dropped it and ran harder, lungs tearing, vision tunneling into black. My body didn't feel like mine anymore. It was a vessel being puppeted through the dark, pushed by some unseen hunger. The woods narrowed, funneled me forward, until the trees abruptly fell away. I stumbled into a clearing so vast it seemed impossible, my boots sinking into soft moss that glowed faintly in the pre-dawn light. And there they were. Cabins, dozens of them, arranged in a perfect circle like standing stones. Each one was too familiar. The lantern-lit porch, the ranger's cabin with the dusty ledgers, the drowned house, impossibly dry. They were fragments of stories I'd lived and survived, stitched together into a single nightmare. Their windows gleamed with a false, dreamlike dawn, casting long fingers of light that seemed to reach for me. I spun in place, searching for an exit, but every path led back to the circle. The forest watched from the edges, patient, calculating. Somewhere behind me, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, inevitable. And then, in unison, every cabin door began a prayer, hinges speaking a grammar older than timber. Inside each doorway, a different version of the same room breathed. A lantern waiting on a table, a ledger half open, wet stairs descending, a stove that hummed as if bees had wintered in its iron. The circle closed not as geometry, but as consent, the way a snare accepts a foot. Dawn pressed one pale thumb to the horizon, and the moss brightened, bioluminescent as shaken plankton. From the trees came the steady metronome of approaching boots, and the air tasted faintly of coins and rain. I chose a door because choosing is the last trick the trapped are allowed. The cabin smelled of pressed paper and wet wool. Dust rose like low weather and settled on my tongue with the intimacy of a hand. On the table, a map had been inked into rings of growth, roots radiating like ribs from a sternum. At the center, a dot wore my name. When I touched it, the floor softened, muscle under bark, and the ledger turned to a blank line, offering the quietest prison: paper. I set the pen down and walked backward, as if retreat could edit the sentence I had almost written. Back in the clearing, the cabins adjusted, trading faces the way water trades borrowed sky. A lantern brightened in one, dimmed in another. Smoke unwound from a chimney that hadn't existed a breath before. I thought of grid cells firing in honeycomb arrays, of the hippocampus soldering place to memory. If the forest owned the circuit, it could move the walls by moving the pattern. But what I didn't expect was the warmth beneath my boots, a pulse rising through soil to meet my heel like a handshake from the roots. The circle was not encircling me, it was circulating me. Footsteps halted at my back. I turned. The ranger waited 30 paces away, brim cutting his eyes into coins, smile patient as winter. His shadow slid beneath my feet and kept going, attaching like a graft. I raised a palm to refuse, and he mirrored the refusal into welcome, hand open as a book. Beyond him, the canopy leaned inward, suturing shut like a wound deciding on scar. I ran. The circle ran with me, doors sliding past, pages riffling, windows brightening. Every cabin kept its distance the way the moon keeps its tides. Fear and awe braided like rope under strain. At the far edge, I struck a ring of knee-high stones. Between them, roots braided a perfect collar, a larynx for something sleeping under the hill. I dropped to my knees and pressed my ear to the moss. The forest was not a place. It was a body, and I was inside its hearing. Sap ticked. My name traveled through cambium in a slow green telegraph. Somewhere below, water coached shale, and the signal returned, softened into yes. Awe rose like heat. Loss followed, quiet as ash. Both were weather the organism could make. Dawn finally chose. One by one, the cabins lost their edges, dissolving into trunks that kept their number, bark stitched where doors had been. The ranger thinned to shade and threaded himself into the trees until only coin-bright flecks remained, dropping like change into deep leaves. In the middle, the moss lifted slightly, a sleeping animal deciding whether to wake. A corridor of daylight opened between two firs, neat as a parting hair. I walked into it because that is what the living do. We choose a seam and call it exit. Behind me, needles resumed their whisper, patient as pages closing. Ahead, the air smelled of road and rain, of towns that never drowned. Yet every step kept time with a deeper pulse, roots drumming a name I knew too well. I did not look back. The question followed, leaf soft and endless. When the forest lets you go, does it ever stop growing you? Subscribe, if you dare.